Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing Mass. Mass is the directorial debut of Fran Kranz and stars Dowd, Reed Birney, Jason Isaacs, and Martha Plimpton. The film centers on two sets of parents who meet for a raw conversation following a violent tragedy. So Jeffrey, what did you think about Mass?
Did you ever have like a film that you admire maybe a little bit more than you like? I think that's what Mass is for me. I was reminded of this. I've been watching Jane Campion films. Like I've been marathoning them leading up to The Power of the Dog. And I feel the same way about Jane Campion, who's like one of the best living directors, but is also, every time I watch her films, I feel a little removed from them, as extraordinary as they are. I think Mass isn't in the same league as Jane Campion, but it's the first thing I thought of. Mass is really easy to admire. And there's a lot of things about it that I think, to go back to that word, really are admirable. I think its intentions are very admirable. I think it's well written. It's extraordinarily acted, which I think we'll get to. But there's something that you almost feel like you're watching it through glass, that you just feel kind of removed from the events, except for these couple of moments that have extraordinary and searing power.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I would say those moments really come to fruition a little bit later on in the movie. Mm-hmm. So Mass is a story about two sets of parents, as we said, who are in a room discussing what is actually a mass shooting that took place. And one set of parents is the parents of a child who was killed, and the other set of parents are the parents of the person who perpetrated the mass shooting. This is a very difficult conversation that's taking place, and one thing I give this movie props towards is just how simple in terms of production design this movie was. It literally takes place the entire runtime in a room. It's one of the fantastic things about this movie, how conversational it is. It really keeps your attention. You're really invested in the conversation. And going back a little bit to that disconnect at the beginning, I think these two sets of parents already come into this room with knowledge that we're not aware of. And so they've had conversations before. And the movie picks up in this moment of this storyline in a way. And you kind of have to just follow along and you learn things as you go. And I think that's one of the things about the movie in terms of its disconnect is that I feel like it did have a payoff in terms of your emotional connection to the characters. And I think that's something that just took a little time to build.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the fact that they're in one room the whole time is both a positive and a negative. There's really not a lot of differentiation between shots here. There's not really a lot of time to breathe, to find something else to look at. I mean, almost certainly that's intentional. I don't think that it works for the entire runtime. I think there could have been maybe a bit more breathing room, but again, I think that setting your first film all in one room with a whole lot of talking is, the kind of film that I like to see from a first-time filmmaker.
One of the aspects I think I really thought was cool about the way it was filmed was that there was a lot of jump cuts that were utilized. There was a lot of times in which the camera crosses the 180-degree line, which if you're not familiar with, when you're shooting a scene, you have the camera situated on the same side of this imaginary line of two characters talking to each other, like we do right now. So that way when we splice between, our eyesight looks like it's looking at each other, because we are. Mm-hmm. This movie kind of did away with a lot of that. I mean, there was times where they followed that kind of formula and other times where they opted against it. And I think this was very intentionally done to create, because what it does, a jump cut, is it creates this like disorienting appearance. So it's like when you switch from one angle to another, you kind of become disoriented because you don't know where you are in the place of the scene in the movie. And I think that was a metaphor for how disorienting this conversation was at times and how chaotic it was at times, is that you didn't know where you were in terms of characters' emotions or feelings or what they were trying to say. I think that was a really cool aspect of the movie that I appreciated.
You're right, because he could have shot this in just the shot, reverse shot kind of way. You're right. There's even these moments where the camera is almost moving as one person is talking to blank space, then to the next person who's talking. So he does find things to do in the room that are kind of interesting.
Yeah, and some of it's just very subtle, and you wouldn't really think about it too much, but it creates that tension that's in the room.
I rather like the first half hour. The first half hour is a lot of people who aren't the main characters kind of fiddling around, being concerned with details. Is the room good enough? Is the light okay? Is this enough food? Is this not enough food? Will the kid that's practicing piano upstairs be a problem? There's a lot of this, and we're like, why are these people so anxious?
Yeah.
The intentions of the film, you kind of have an idea what's going on, but the intentions of the film are made very clear when the mother of the victim says, "Because your child killed mine." And then you immediately understand why everybody was being so concerned about the details up until this point. So I rather liked that part of it. I didn't feel very removed during that portion, actually. I felt very engaged because you're supposed to be asking questions about why is this occurring? Why are people so concerned about these things? In the middle of the film, they get really bogged down in the details of this conversation. And in one way, to go back to what I was saying before, it's admirable because the way that this conversation evolves is to take these kind of preconceptions we have about the parents of mass shooters and to what degree can we blame them for how their child turned out and the hurt that their child inflicted on the world. So a lot of those things that you might see in the news, a lot of those talking points around Columbine, when Columbine happened, are explored here in really interesting ways and in ways that are really natural to the conversation, which I think is probably the main and most admirable thing about the film, to use that word for the 5th time.
This movie is definitely at its best when it's dealing with a lot of these moral quandaries about grief. How do you grieve your son who committed this horrible atrocity, but also come to terms with just your memory of him and who he used to be before he committed this atrocity? And then on the other end, you have the parents dealing with their grief of losing their son. They need some sort of explanation.
Both sets of parents get to tell a story about their son, and I won't spoil either story. But when you get to that portion of the film, it really illustrates what their grief is. To take on this kind of subject matter, there's a lot of pressure kind of to do it justice, right? Which I think this film does. You really have to walk a line. You have to, I think, not be too political, not be too outspoken. You have to be honest about everybody involved, the victims and the perpetrators. The only other film that I've seen take on this subject matter in a worthwhile way is the film We Need to Talk About Kevin. Lynn Ramsey, I think, is one of our best living filmmakers, so it's not to pit those two films against each other. But I think that film and Mass really do justice to the subject matter. A subject matter that is really not spoken about a lot, I think, in film.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most wonderful things about this movie is I think the conversations that are being had in this room, some of it is so much that people don't talk about when it comes to mass shootings, especially in mainstream media. I feel like so much gets lost in the conversation, and I feel like this movie really delved into the stories after these events occur, people's lives and how they're affected and what happens to them. I feel like media tends to just pay attention to these moments when they happen, but there's so much that's happening after the fact that I feel like just isn't being paid attention to, and I think this movie brings a lot of awareness to that.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, this film does a very good job of undoing, I think, these narratives that we build for ourselves whenever there's a mass shooting. But I think this film really delves into those things and makes you understand maybe how we find ourselves in those narratives and how they're quite a bit more complex than they might seem on television.
All right, so you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, I give Mass a B. I think that, again, that there's so much to like here. I think the acting is just unbelievable, especially from Dowd. I can't get past some of the, again, we talked about the clumsy direction. There's a little bit of that, and just feeling like I'm on the outside of the film sometimes. I had that feeling throughout it.
Yeah, I give this movie a B+. I agree with you pretty much on everything you said. I do think the acting is absolutely phenomenal in this movie. We gave a shout to Dowd twice, but Martha Plimpton is fantastic as well. She has there's a lot of reservedness about her. There's a lot of scenes where she's just kind of still and pondering. And you see it in the emotions in her face. And I think she just did a wonderful job with that. But yeah, I thought this was a very good movie. I definitely think it's worth seeking out and giving it a view.
And that's it for a review of Mass, which is now playing in theaters. What did you think of Mass? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.